Welcome, James Spee. Dr. James Spee is an experienced entrepreneur, everyone, and a veteran university professor who believes, rightly so, I think, that education must pivot. Well, it's undeniable in my humble view, and that education will pivot whether we wanted to or not. He's going to talk a little bit today about micro-credential programs and what those are, and skills training, and the difference between skills training and a liberal arts education, and what does the future hold for students, and how can we give them hope? How can we demystify the options that are available to them or presented to them? So welcome, Dr. Spee. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Harris. Great to be here.
Thank you. So you're an expert in change management. Tell us what change management is, first of all. What is that?
Well, I first took a class when I was in graduate school. They didn't have a summer school at my grad school, so I went out to a school in Pasadena and wound up reconnecting with one of my professors who'd moved to California at the same time. And I just found the book. I was going through my library at my office. We used a book on school district change because school districts are considered one of the hardest things to change because people just get so embedded in what they're doing and love it and passionate. And if you criticize them, they take it very personally. So the model we were looking at back in the 80s was one of freeze, unfreeze, change, and then freeze again. So the idea was managing that process to get people to break out of what they were doing before, envision something new, and then somehow move them towards that. Well, as that model was already creaky, it got even worse in the 90s because there was no time at which things stabilized. There was no refreeze. There was never a time in which you said, okay, we're done, it's all great, let's go. Although institutions like my university, we do tend to freeze things like curricula because it's very expensive to change them, but you're always making changes around the edges. So for example, just taking your on-ground class online, you'd think that would just be, oh, set up a Zoom meeting for 4 hours. Well, nobody does Zoom for 4 hours. So now what am I going to do with the rest of that time? So part of the idea, and I was using this methodology this morning in our prior meeting, one of the methods I really like is called appreciative inquiry, where instead of asking people what's wrong, you ask them what's going well and how would they enhance that and make it more vital, more improve everybody's well-being. And that, I think, this positive approach is the way I want to go with this pivot. Not to say that what you've done before was horrible, but we have new objectives and new goals and really a different situation than we had before. I also teach a lot of strategic management and strategy. I pivoted back to teaching strategy because I could only do org change if somebody wanted it to happen. And strategy is where you figure that out. And the strategy is where you look at that combination between what's happening outside in society and in the natural environment at the social level, natural level, economic level, all those things, technology. And then how does that impact what I'm doing? How is what I did going to have to change in response to that? Now for entrepreneurship, which is another of my interests, then it's where's the opportunity that nobody's found yet? Try to peel that back. So that's
very interesting.
Bigger picture of change. It's always in the context of societal, sort of some particular sector of society, or at the organizational level, or even at the team level. You really have to figure out what scale, and then that makes it even tougher. And now we're talking about changes that are in problems that are so intractable that anything you do can make them worse before they get better. So you got to really be careful.
That's interesting. You alluded to curricula change, and you're certainly, in fact, it's undeniable as well that you're in the right place at the right time, as if age demographics and technology hadn't already created a very dynamic need or a need for dynamic training, I should say.
Yeah.
Now you have COVID, right? And that has certainly exacerbated an already stressful situation for students, and I dare say institutions, because their curricula cannot remain static, right?
They were already shifting.
Right. And so on that note, what in your view does the future of work look like for students?
Well, it's a lot more of what we're doing right now is talking to each other over these media and then trying to communicate clearly in writing in between, even in a chat medium. I mean, we don't have our chat on, but we could. If there were more people on this meeting, we might be trying to monitor 3 different channels at once. We might be working in global teams. I just completed a project. We've been working on it since 2017. It's a book with 12 chapters. We have authors writing about South America, North America, Australia, Asia, and Africa. Not all the, and some of the authors are in New Zealand. We're in 20 different time zones. We've got one guy from Pakistan, wrote 2 chapters about conflict resolution, both in the tribal groups in Afghanistan and that Pakistan border. And then he looked kind of globally at tribal approaches to conflict resolution and made implications about what that can do for us. That's a global team. I've met 4 of the people on the project personally. Everybody else we communicated through email and just transmitted data. And then we probably had 10 or 15 other people reviewing the project. That's going to be more and more the kind of world for knowledge work anyway. For hands-on work, this is really interesting. And I just was talking to a guidance counselor at a really nice, interesting high school here in San Bernardino, California. And they can't get anybody into their labs. They got funding to build beautiful new labs for different hands-on classes. But with COVID, you can't bring anybody in yet. And if you can, it's going to be at a lot smaller capacity. So finding ways to bring that learning to the students, I think, is going to be really important. How do you teach somebody how to work on a car if you have to sit right next to them? Well, we got to wait. Do we wait for the virus to subside or for a good vaccine, or do we find ways to enhance that hands-on work with simulators? I talked to somebody at the Boeing company in Seattle in the 90s when I was job hunting and the academic market was really south. He was building simulators for Boeing airplanes that would break parts that he said, if I broke this on the real airplane, that's $1 million repair. But I can break it over and over again. It was a model of the hydraulic system, and it was a way to teach people how to diagnose hydraulic problems. And he said the other thing was that there were places on the airplane you can't see without taking 300 pieces off the airplane. And he was using CAD drawings in 3D and very primitive stuff just on an early Mac. But he was able to help them visualize when they're reaching around behind the refrigerator to tighten that fitting, what was there, because he could peel back the layers. That's an example of not trying to adapt to the online world. That's really transforming it and doing something you can't do. So my vision is that we transform education into something we can't do now, and stop complaining that it doesn't work as well as my face-to-face classroom. And I think the interesting thing around why I'm really interested in these micro-credentialing programs especially is the idea that you're not bound to that master schedule anymore. This was an unmet need that I just identified yesterday or this morning with this teacher I'm going to start asking other people about. But if you've got all these requirements for graduation in high school, it's huge, and you want to take welding and English literature, and they're both offered at 3:30 or 12:30, you can't take them both. It's physically impossible. Well, that's no longer a barrier in online because you just go watch the recordings and participate, and that stops being an issue. So I think that's the other pivot of, rather than seeing asynchronous and online as a barrier, you see it as an opportunity. And you still have to have those face-to-face interactions because those are so valuable in terms of value judgments and meaning, and gives us hope. But at the same time, if we're talking about moving people into the workforce successfully, we got to find really creative ways to use these tools. That's my goal, and that's what I'm thinking about. And I think we started off just talking about entrepreneurship education when I began my study, and now I'm looking at that whole broad base of things. And that was my favorite class in high school was auto shop. We called it power mechanics, but power mechanics is a great title because I actually took a class on power in my MBA, but it was management power, not automotive power. But they're very similar. You got to know how to do it, and you have to want to.
Interesting hearing you talk about change and adaptation given your background, which is, at least in part, you've done so many things, but you have a background in mechanical engineering and aviation. And before I ask you about pilots, let's just piggyback on what you said, because it's fascinating. I ponder this question myself. Will we be able to appropriately train? Mechanical engineering is a great example. Auto mechanics, anyone in the hands-on fields, massage therapists for that matter. That's a real challenge, right, James, in this environment?
Yeah, and I think people are talking about their visions for what they're going to do as soon as it lifts. But I in the aviation field, I was volunteering at a youth aviation program over at Flaybob Airport in Rubidoux, which is an old home building and experimental aircraft center. Now it's got people restoring vintage airplanes. One of their programs that started and ended before I got there, they worked with gang members and taught them airplane repair skills. And now the two graduates from that program have taken over an airplane restoration business and are entrepreneurs. They're also running a health club at the airport, a CrossFit place where they were. When those reopen, they'll be doing that. So aviation is a really interesting example of hands-on skill. And there's so much tacit knowledge in it that you just have to be around it and you pick it up. But people can come into it, but they need to be welcomed and they need to be brought in. And there is going to be a big need for it. But what we found already, this was probably 10 years ago, there was an instructor who'd shortened what was a 2.5 to 3 year curriculum down to 1 year by accelerating it. And he also split the skills demonstration part from the book learning part. And he tested you as soon as you got the skill. Whereas the federal government model, the FAA model, was wait until the end of a 2.5 year program and then test you on hundreds of skills that they're going to pick from random. Well, of course, the failure rate's really, really high. And it's almost intentionally like they're trying to keep you out of that business. So that's the other sort of example I have of a micro-credentialing approach to a bigger credential. But that way you only flunk that one little part. You don't flunk the whole thing. And you could actually, let's say you passed the welding part of that, and there was a job for an aircraft welder. If they had that micro-credential at the federal level, they'd say, oh, well, we just need you to do welding. Keep working on the other certifications. We'll pay you $25 an hour to weld. And you're like, well, yeah, right on. Okay. And you may decide not to get the rest of the certification, but you might be motivated to then go back and go, well, maybe I'll go back and pound away at the power plant one now. I didn't do very well on that before, but now I've got income. I can afford to go back and take that. The other thing is that if you take that whole program all the way from start to finish at a for-profit school, you might be $40,000 in debt by the end. And I don't really like that model very much either. I said somebody whose students graduate with $100,000 in debt. So it's like at the career tech, that's not unusual. At the undergrad level, we're seeing, people with 5 years of, or their entire life, they're still paying off their student loan and their kids are going to college or their kids are done. That's not a very good legacy.
I'm going to get to that question, of course, and about the affordability of higher ed. But it's what you said is interesting, because it seems to me, we're debunking the not just the traditional model, traditional models, plural, of curricula and the rigidity of the time frame within which those programs are typically taught. And given the increasingly borderless nature of higher education, it seems to me that students are more able to do that if they understand their choice and what they may or may not be good at. But you're saying, just so that I'm clear, because there's an there's a dire need for qualified pilots in Canada, and I surmise the same is true in the United States, correct?
Well, it was up until COVID, but China is the other big market that, as they're expanding out, they're planning airline routes where they were. Well, what's funny, my brother and I both got pilot's licenses in the 70s, and neither of us had 20/20 vision. And this was before LASIK. And, and we both sort of went other directions. But my brother said, if somebody came in, a recruiter from the airlines came in, this was like when we were in our 20s, and said, I can give you 20/20 vision. They said, which one of us would get our, our teeth kicked in trying to jump over the other one to get that job? And it's like, maybe, but I'm looking back on it, and I think I would have let my brother take that job. I don't think it was right for me.
Right.
So in a way, that physical limitation was okay, because I don't really have the mentality and the personality type to do that kind of repetitive task very well. I worked on a cruise ship one summer, and 3 months of working on steering a cruise boat was plenty. It was great. I loved doing it, but that's something you do to take time off from the other things you do. It isn't a career path for me. But that idea of exploration, so much of what I've done throughout my career is to volunteer for things and try them out. And I think the best career programs at the high school level, and this teacher I was talking to today, they've got 3 pathways, but they also have these industry groups that their school is funded well enough to do. They're a big enough school. So they've got 1,000 students taking these career and technical classes. And she said what gets her excited is when somebody goes on a field trip and comes back and goes, hey, I could do that. And I was around an airport and around airplanes. So I was like, hey, I could do this. Turns out that I really resonated with the mechanics. And I think that's why I became a mechanical engineer. I tried aeronautical engineering. It was too weird for me, too much math. And I liked the hands-on part of mechanical engineering. And at the time, I just boxed up my books to give them away, but we took classes in machining. We had a machine shop. I still have a scar on my finger from putting my hand in the table saw at University of Washington. I went back on a tour a couple of years ago, and I said, "Oh, there's that saw." It now has safety stuff all over it. But
Sounds gruesome, but don't talk to a lawyer about math.
Yeah,
if you think you had challenges, it may be the sole reason, not the sole reason I went to law school, but your point certainly is not lost on me. So what is the most, let's talk about, you've been teaching at University of Redlands for many years now, and you've seen many students come and go, and what is the most common fear that students have based on your years of experience as an instructor? And just before you answer, James, the reason I'm asking is because fear puts up walls, and we've had other guests come on to our platform and talk about emotional intelligence, and fear can be crippling. So it's a vital question, I think.
Well, let me flip it around, because I teach a lot of capstone classes, and you're always looking for them to use some stellar piece of knowledge that we've given them over the last 1.5 or 2 years, and say, well, thank you, Professor so-and-so, because I never would have understood concept C in class B. And instead, I'll say, well, what skills and knowledge did you use from this program? And they said, self-confidence. Really, that's most consistent. What did you gain? What did this do for you? It's like, well, I always had lots of ideas, but I was always a little hesitant to bring them up. And being in a safe environment, and we're pretty proud about that. I think we do pretty well in that. We've got some problems on it, but creating a safe environment where they can advocate for ideas, and even though they're hypothetical, because these are case studies and nobody's going to hear them, that gives them that helps them realize that their ideas and their analysis matters, and that they can present new things at work. So I added a question, and I was trying to add online content to one of my strategy classes a couple of weeks ago. I added the question, does anybody care about what you think at work? Are you ever asked to make a decision? Do you ever get to choose on your own? And I think that's going to be really fruitful, because I found some articles about undergrad business students being treated like drones. They're just there to do work, which means they're being put into jobs that don't really need a college degree, but someone wanted to simplify their search process. So rather than specifying exactly what the job requires, you just say you need a college degree.
Right.
But the people who got college degrees at really good schools and have great family connections, they wind up getting the managerial jobs, not the people with business degrees. This was this claim. I don't totally trust that, but that's why I like entrepreneurship. It's like, if that's the pattern where people of privilege are automatically going to get those, even though they have zero training in it, then opt out of that and start your own business. And women are increasingly doing that. And I want to see that happen with people of color and people who feel like they're not being welcomed into our economy. We got to level that playing field. And I think this discussion we're having, both of how do you help people get technical skills that make them more hireable, but also how do you have them be optimistic and self-confident enough to say, I'm worthy to found a business. I'm just as entitled as anybody else to start something new and serve my community that way, and maybe make a better living for my family.
Absolutely, all great points, and one of the ancillary benefits, I'll say, that came out of COVID, because obviously COVID is a great tragedy for the world. That's undeniable. But there are some, I'd like to think anyway, that some positives have come out of this. And one of the things that I see happening both in Canada and the United States and outside of North America is the world pivoting, but really pivoting into this entrepreneurial mindset, but also into much more a state of self-awareness. And it's that is a strange form of evolution to me, but I do see it as evolution, James, and I agree with you. And your point is not lost on me that entrepreneurship puts the steering wheel in the hands of people who have maybe traditionally felt not empowered to do what they're now doing. So that's an excellent point that you've made. Now, University of Redlands, where you teach, it's a smaller university, a beautiful school, but a smaller university with, I think, 4,500 students or so. Are smaller universities concerned about what will happen post-COVID? And if so, why?
Well, this is another place where the pattern had already started and this just accelerated. So if you go to any databases of liberal arts colleges, particularly ones without professional schools, they have been dropping like flies, merging or just disappearing, stopping in the middle of the school year. Sometimes they'll make it to the end of the school year. Sometimes they lose their accreditation. I mean, that can happen to public schools too if they're mismanaged. But it's just the overall demand and the demographics for residential, especially undergraduate programs in the liberal arts, is not looking very good.
Yeah.
And so do you cut your price? Do you raise your price? Do you raise your price and discount more, which we've tried? We use yield management. So like the airlines, you're trying to fill up your cohorts. But if you make a mistake, you wind up with a plane that's too full and you got to turn people away at the gate, or they wind up crammed in the seats because there isn't enough room. A couple of years ago, we dropped our this is for the on-campus program, not School of Business, but for the on-campus program, we raised our discount rate, which means we dropped our actual tuition more than anybody else in our competitive ring, and we snagged a whole bunch of people. So the next year, out of panic, we bumped it down or up, whatever you want to say it. We increased our price, and then we had a record low. It's like, oh shoot, because everybody else saw us and reacted. So they are constantly playing this game, which I don't want to play, because there's something wrong with your business model when it's that volatile and when you can't consistently attract people. And I think part of that is this attitude that the customer is the student, not society and not the employers in your area or the bigger business community. So when I focus on entrepreneurs and startups, and the logo behind me for 1IE, that's a nonprofit that just formed that we're working on getting going. And we want to be a support group for startups, and universities and colleges and schools are, but we have institutional goals that are different from the founder of the startup. And we can feed people into those, But our primary goal is to get revenue from teaching and creating graduates, not necessarily from getting people out into the business and getting their business started. So this mindset of micro-credentialing frees us and liberates us from that expectation that everybody has to get to the end of the 4-year path. Because if that stops being, or the 6-year path, if you're talking about graduation, but if you could have, instead of 4,500 students aiming at either a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, what if we had 10,000 students at all different stages of things? What if we had 20 or 30,000? I got one high school with 1,000 students taking career and technical education, not a one of them studying entrepreneurship. What if I could capture 400 of them and give them pre-college credit? Now, maybe the community college is the better person to do that, but what if they got through that community college and got their AA degree? And then I said, why don't you come to Redlands and work on your business some more? They got the business almost ready to go. So that's this idea of stackable credentialing. But the point isn't to get the AA anymore. It's really an extreme version of instrumental. It's the point is to get your business up and running and maybe involve your whole family in it. So I talked to a really creative elementary school principal last week that my friend Justin, got to talk to Diana. Boy, I talked to Diana and she's incredible. She wants to start them at 6th grade with lemonade stands. So then they come into middle school already primed with this growth mindset. And then they come to high school and they're like, okay, let me at it. Where's those classes? I'm ready to go. As opposed to, oh, geez, I don't want to go. I hated middle school. That was a horrible experience for me. It's like, but it's model airplanes. That was my middle school experience.
It's an excellent point though that you're making. The lemonade stand, and what your colleague's vision was or is. It creates a mindset at a very early stage, and wouldn't it be great, if we could take what I'll call stigmatized mentality, worker mentality, turn workers into owners, by giving them the tools that they need. And my next question really was just about that, was about micro-credential programs. But I think you've answered it. You've said that they're stackable, right? And that's an excellent point. Now that segues into a question about revenue erosion within the liberal arts stream. And do you think that that's impacting all universities or just most of them or many of them?
Most of them, the ones that already had robust online programs or were online 100%. Same with charter schools. The charter schools that were already online, they're fine. So they were designed, they didn't even blink. So homeschool kids that were already on remote learning with their parents, they were fine. I have a niece and nephew. My nephew's a stay-at-home dad who homeschools his kids. It's like, what did they see? They probably bubbled with their other parents in their neighborhood and kept going. They didn't close down. They probably had, they couldn't do field trips.
Right.
Couldn't go to the museum, so they had to do virtual field trips. But they moved to the middle of Indiana. There aren't that many places to go on a day trip. Their backyard's got cows and horses. They're fine, But then somebody in an inner city place where mom and dad can't work, they're all home together. They're sharing one phone, and the target, I think, this high school, Pacific High School, 93% of their students are from socially disadvantaged households. The neighborhood in Riverside, same thing, and some of them undocumented, which means then they are not able to get into traditional career paths, but they can start a business. It's possible for them to do things. So there's rays of hope that can start to break them out of that poverty cycle and get them into the economy without it feeling like a struggle and without it feeling like it's just another government aid program.
You've touched on something so important, about dreamers and immigrants to the United States, and that they just have to have hope for the future, because that's just integral, right, to the American dream. And so, on that note, let's talk a little bit about skills, James. And you see post-secondary students But they come from somewhere, right? So they're coming from a breadth of different backgrounds, right? Different places, different backgrounds. You've been teaching a long time. So putting your teaching hat on, what is the most important skill for a student to have?
Boy, the one I see that hurts them a lot is poor time management.
Time
Not
management.
tracking. They expect me to do that time management for them. And some people are blaming that on this generation, but I don't think it's generational. I think it's just you sort of you're coasting through life and everybody tells you what to do. So you stop taking any responsibility for that. One of the programs I'm helping with is down at Miramar College in San Diego, and Tanya Hertz is the coordinator there, and she's done a great job. She's got very high expectations. She's like, if you can't commit to a once a week meeting with me, you're never going to get your business going, because you have to be able to be here when you say you're going to be here. So of course I missed a meeting yesterday with one of her founders. I'm terrible at stuff like that. And he was very forgiving, but he's on the ball. He's in college. He's not actually attending that community college except for this one class, but he's at California State University in Long Beach, and he's got great ideas and he listens and he's responsible. But instead of me setting up the Zoom meeting as his mentor, I said, you set up the Zoom meeting. And I knew that was one of Tanya's goals, is the founders need to take responsibility for contacting you, not the other way around. So it's like, put them in control. And I think that's the big learning for me, is without that skill, these asynchronous self-paced programs die, because people just get too busy. And I've tried a couple of them, and I get to a certain point, it's like, I got to go back and do that. And I get the reminders, I got to go back and do that. And then your priorities change and you forget to finish it. But that ability to commit to something and then follow through. On the other hand, when I'm working on my startup stuff, I'm very motivated. When I'm working on I'm working on my aviation stuff, generally I'll put it off, and then I sit down and I just slog through. So we just had a really good breakthrough on one of my aviation projects. We got, my friend Ernie got his modification, a landing gear modification, approved. I'm so proud of him. But the skills he brought in was just persistence. That's another one, this resilience and persistence. We're hearing a lot about that. And that's a COVID generated thing, but that's not just COVID, that's all kinds of stuff. But if you're from a family where, mom and dad are both working, you're left on your own, you're in daycare when you're not in school, mom and dad come home tired, they don't have time to talk to you about, hey, what'd you do in school today? What do you can be better than this. That developing that persistence and giving people hope, I think that's where our public school teachers just shine. That's where they're at their best, when they're doing that. They're giving those kids hope.
You're really resonating with me as a parent. My kids are 12, 9, and 9. I have twin girls. Mm-hmm. And despite having my 12-year-old son, who gets excellent grades, but despite having him read Stephen Covey, time management is absolutely, you've just zoned in on something that is so, I don't want to misuse this word given the gravity of COVID, but it is a micro pandemic of its own. Yeah. The time management challenge for kids today. And so educators who can really help kids with this at all levels, I have nothing but respect for them. And that leads me into another question, which is the flip side of the coin. What's the most important skill for an educator, do you think?
Well, I think that's shifting a little bit in this world. But I think the lens I look through this, I figured this out about 10 years ago. I'd been reviewed for 15 years by Redlands, and every year they'd say, love your work, but there's no theme to it. What's the underlying agenda? Where are you going? And I was at a workshop on design thinking, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I'm a designer. Duh, I'm an engineer. I design curriculum. My hobby is designing airplane parts. I mean, that kind of says organizational design is the part of change that I really studied as a doctoral student. And there's an area that came out of University of Washington, interestingly, and I said in a podcast, called universal design, which is how educators can design interactions with students. And they were specifically talking about the web, but it isn't just the web. And I think this goes to hands-on training too. The ability to empathize with a student who isn't present. So that's an ethical challenge. My friend Carlo calls it moral imagination. His advisor was Patricia Werhane out of University of Virginia. And Werhane says that to behave ethically, instead of rules, if you put in a practice of thinking about the people that aren't present.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of that is thinking about that student who may be blind or deaf or has trouble using a mouse because they don't have good motor control. And thinking about like transcribing this. If we put this on the web, universal design would say, we don't put it out unless there's a transcript. And somebody could slow it down or speed it up, or they could read it instead of, or see subtitles. So that's the idea that I shouldn't have to tell you that I have a different way of working from everybody else. You should figure that out and offer me the option to get that content or that skill in a way that's meaningful for me. And that eliminates the possibility that you inadvertently discriminate or leave somebody behind.
That's a fantastic point. It's really not just an inclusion specific point that you're making, but that kind of thinking from a design standpoint just makes the world a better place.
Sure.
Right. It just and now let's talk a little bit about professions or vocations.
Mm-hmm.
Where more specifically do you see the future growing, for kids in the living in the United States, or even in let's take the great nation state of California, because it is a nation state.
Well, my friend John, who's also been on this program, he's been studying the issues for senior citizens. So there's huge opportunities around serving that aging population because it's growing. I'm part of it. I'm trying really hard not to be the disabled part of it. But you can see that I'm aging. I trip over my words a little more than I used to. I have put the yogurt away in the microwave instead of the refrigerator, but it was just that one time. So we know that there's going to be huge demands in that field and in the whole medical area, but that doesn't add value. That just simply takes care of us. So the caring professions are super important, and people are really motivated to be in those, and that's wonderful. But in order to support that effort, you need people producing things, and not just services. But I think both political parties in this election have at least made promises that they will improve the odds of manufacturing things and bring some of that back from offshore. And it's become really clear around, especially like medical gear, that we need things either producible here and not have to wait for them to get shipped, especially when there's a worldwide shortage. I like the idea of improving that, but even just basic skills, this bias against hands-on work has really hampered our ability to fill jobs like bricklayers and electricians and plumbers. And those can be excellent pathways to middle class, but you have to be encouraged to do them and not thought of as somehow lesser because you chose that option. And I'm really disappointed that in my 25 years of my career, this pattern of college degree. At the same time, I don't want to ever tell somebody that they can't do one. But I might also say, why don't you get your income stable with a high paying job? And then when you have time, come back and feed your soul with some really useful liberal arts stuff, because that's going to provide meaning to your life. Being a plumber may not.
That's a fantastic point. I had on our platform, we hosted woman by the name of Tashmia Ismail Saville, who is the chief executive of Yes South Africa. They're an NGO committed to addressing youth unemployment, which obviously is rampant.
Yep.
In a place like South Africa, 6 out of 10 kids, I'm told, I think that's right, are unemployed. But the one thing that they've done right there, and this piggybacks on your great comment, James, is they've created something called a rainbow economy to get away from the notion of blue collar versus white collar work, to effectively destigmatize labor, and which in so many respects is, and no disrespect to my brothers and sisters in the practice of law, but from a labor market demand standpoint, it may become, it is already, far more important to have roofers and plumbers and technical people, mechanical engineers, people at lower and higher levels of aviation, right, who are fixing airplanes and cars, and technical people. That's that kind of thinking is it fair to say that we're not quite there yet in North America? We haven't really ingrained that kind of mentality into parents aren't necessarily getting it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I remember one of my professor colleagues saying that she was having a career conversation with her daughter at maybe same age as your kids, and her daughter brought up plumbing as an option, and she had to choke back like, what? No, and she, no. Sure, honey, if you want to be a plumber, I want to make sure you're the best plumber. And we laughed at the time. And now I think I turn around there and go, well, why not?
Right.
But the other thing and this is where this looping back to micro-credentials, if you take apart auto mechanics, aviation mechanics, you take apart any of the medical professions, the biomed stuff, hands-on, the same skill sets that we say we're trying to develop of critical thinking and good communication and empathy and multiple points of view are all embedded in those other forms of what we call training. We denigrate them as training, not education. But this in California, and this is actually bigger than this, I'm still learning, there's something called linked learning where they try to link the academic curriculum to the career curriculum and create, they're calling them pathways, which aren't necessarily to an industry, they're more specific, but they might be more interdisciplinary too. So with these pathways, you can blend your welding training with your English, literature, and creative work and arts class. And the great example I heard, I keep telling this one over and over again, is a welding student wrote a poem in his English class, and then he was assigned to make a sculpture in welding class, and he won an art award for his welding. That's cool. That means welding can be more than just a means to a paycheck. And to appreciate the beauty of a good weld. I took a welding class in mechanical engineering, by the way. I love welding. I'm terrible at it, but I have a class or a colleague at the airport that does all the welding projects. And what he loves is I come in with creative problems for him to solve. And so, man, if I had to pay that guy, I'd be out thousands of dollars, but he just likes working with me for some reason. And we have a lot of fun building stupid stuff, but to get to where that person is, I mean, he's had 30 years of experience doing that. And
right.
Yet he doesn't run a welding business. He doesn't have that skill set. That's not in his wheelhouse.
Right.
Other people take that piece of it. And that's okay too. I mean, he still has a great skill set, but it doesn't include that piece of it. But sometimes you find somebody who's got that piece, maybe they're not as good at the technical side, but they have the ability to diagnose. My brother, who's been an MD, he just retired as an MD after 40 years, he could diagnose a car running badly in 13 seconds, and he'd have the repair underway. And I'm sure he was the same way with his patients. He took 2 years of auto mechanics like I did. But for him, auto mechanics was just an extension of diagnosing other things. That's
interesting. So he had a diagnostic mindset.
He did, yeah. Whereas I'd be tearing the whole thing apart. I have the engineering mindset. I'd keep tearing apart pieces until I found something that was broken. And then I go, oh shoot, I could have fixed that 20 minutes ago, but hey, isn't this cool? Let's keep pulling. What happens if I pull on this wire? You know? Whereas my brother, he's just like, that wire's broken, connect a new wire from the front to the back, get the car running. Let's get up and going. And I'm like, oh no, I think I got to tear this whole wiring system out and redo the whole thing. So
So
I have
you've raised an interesting point about you've talked a lot about vocations and let's talk about co-op programs for a second.
Sure.
Because what's the value of co-op? What do you think about that?
Oh, you want to hear my co-op poster child? The speaker at my brother's high school graduation gave a wonderful talk. She went into mechanical engineering at University of Washington. When I went to Michigan, she was 2 years ahead of me. So she graduated before I got there. Otherwise, I would have seen her. And she's just a terrific person. I ran into her at a reunion, the 100th anniversary of my mechanical engineering program. She had been in co-op at University of Washington and worked a bunch of different jobs. And when I met her, she was the CEO of the REI sporting goods company. She'd also worked for Shell Oil, and I think for Bank of America or one of its predecessors, one of the companies they bought. And a couple of years after that, President Obama nominated her as Secretary of the Interior.
Wow.
So what does a co-op program do? It gets you thinking about work in a different way. Now she's a brilliant person. She was going to succeed with or without it, but I thought the fact that I didn't even know that choice existed. If I had, I probably would have jumped on it, but I was programmed to go to my dad's college and be a legacy, and that's what I did. So, you do what your parents aim you at. But I heard that story later. I'm like, we should have all been doing that. Now, my co-op story personally was I got a job at the wind tunnel because I was a dual major. And so I worked in computing for the University of Washington wind tunnel. Who was our number one client? Boeing. So that was the equivalent of a co-op. It was 20 hours a week, sometimes more, full-time in the summer, except I skipped the summer because I had to work on a boat. I was already game in the system, getting other experience with engineering on the nautical side. But those weren't the paths for me. I came back and did work for Boeing a little bit, but I knew that wasn't where I was supposed to be. I knew boating wasn't the choice, but I was privileged to be able to go in and try these different pathways. And I've done that my whole career. I went to an early retirement seminar about 10 years ago. And at the time I was volunteering at the airport, and they asked me, do you want to come over and direct education programs for us? This was in 07. And then everything crashed. I'm like, oh man, I'm glad I dodged that bullet, because I would have been out of a job and not gotten hired back at Redlands. But what they said was you should put your toe into things. And I think co-ops are a way to put your toe into things. Internships, co-ops, hands-on apprenticeship programs. We have one here with the electrical union. I'm trying to get an appointment with the person who runs that. Any of these things that get you out there in the work world. Growing up in a family business, I could go out in the summers and hang out at my dad's shops. And sometimes it was shoveling gravel and moving things around and doing manual labor. My brother and one of my brothers and I took a building down and we reused the lumber to build other stuff. We were doing all kinds of stuff when we were kids. And I think that was a great exposure. My other brother, Doug, hated going to work with Dad. He's his own boss now. He's the entrepreneur in the family. I think he could have run that business better than Dad did, and he knew it, and it just drove him nuts.
Well, I've heard it said, and I can't help but agree with this on a certain level. Anyway, I've heard it said that everything should be co-op, and notwithstanding that, in Canada, lawyers have a 1-year apprenticeship. Known as articling, and the very first call I ever received, this was 26 years ago, was from someone accused of murder, and it was terrifying for me. I was wet behind the ears, but that year, I think for most lawyers, whether you're a lawyer or whatever else, whatever your training is, that hands-on training is so important. But it creates a different kind of value, I think. Let's talk about the cost of education in the United States today. You alluded to that earlier, and doesn't a co-op system defray or address, at least in part, that issue, James?
Yes and no. It does help you generate more income. And the equivalent in doctoral programs is the ability to teach undergrad classes and get teaching experience. And I had to do that by going somewhere else. My graduate school didn't have undergraduates. It was strictly a grad school. And it was part of the Claremont Consortium. None of the 5 Claremont colleges, there's more now, none of them had business programs. There was an economics program. None of them would hire us as adjuncts, even with master's degrees. So there was no work at my home school. I had to go somewhere else. On the other hand, the universities that do have that system really exploit their grad students on research projects. They're talking about unionizing because they're so overworked. We've had to revise our pay structure because our adjunct pay is pretty bad. But at least I got my feet wet. 5 years before I started at Redlands, I was able to start teaching off and on for different people. And it turned out to be my go-to thing. It was like when all other sources of revenue dried up, I could always find something part-time to teach. And it gave me joy doing that. And I realized that's where I need to be. I just want to be doing it full time. But graduate programs now are doing a better job of giving people exposure to teaching skills and making that part of that. And that makes us better when we come to college. But boy, our certification requirements compared to somebody in the K-12 world are nothing. I mean,
right. So
it's close to that. I kind of diverted off your question. Come back and bring me back on topic. I think.
No, you didn't really. I hear you saying that it's desirable, to have co-op. It to some extent.
But the real issue isn't. Yes, would that enable the student to better pay for their education while they're in it? Yes, but I don't think they should be paying for it. That's my personal opinion. They should be paying something, but also I think if the cost could be driven down to where it was affordable without government subsidies, then, and without huge amounts of philanthropy, wouldn't that be smart work?
Yes.
So that's why I went back to this universal design question. The other piece of universal design is allowing people to do it at their own pace on their own time frame. Forcing people to come to class during the day when they could be at work, or forcing them to come at night when they could be at work, is not a good system. I ran into this problem in the 90s. I started to work after Desert Storm, but I had students in the military still deploying to the Middle East. And prior to the military having internet, they were gone. I lost them for that whole deployment. And yet they probably had hours and hours of time when they could sit and learn. And by 2000, the military had put in dual internet, non-secure internet on shipboard and everywhere. And so they could just do that, but we didn't adapt. So I had people Skyping into my class from time to time, but that was like onesies and twosies. I never had anybody do an entire class, but now that's fine. We designed for that. So that shifting to a design in which the co-op is built in, the assumption is that you're going to be working and earning money or running your business. A co-op, running a business is a co-op, but there's some evidence that you don't want to jump into that business too soon. You want to actually work in that field, work for somebody else, and make some contacts and develop some credibility before you make that leap. So a co-op program or an extended internship is great. We've had a consulting capstone course in the School of Business for about 8 or 9 years. My friend Mike McQueen, he's a former accountant, so he likes that kind of business. He sets up the clients and we send the student teams out. And then for my environmental studies students who are studying sustainable business, I really push them to find real organizations to work for and real problems, either a startup. One of them is working on one of my startup ideas. We've got a startup outdoor recreation program out in Joshua Tree National Park. And I think I've got my 3rd or 4th student working with them on projects. We've done a bunch of stuff with them. One of their board members is the former superintendent of the park. And it's just a really cool group. And they love it when I send them free interns. Everybody likes, free workers. And then I've got an MBA student working for me on this CTE research project. And she's actually graduated. I got just enough grant money to hire her for a few hours, and she's been having a blast. So I think when you can get people into those hands-on situations, if they're not in one now, but what they probably are in. So this is a misnomer. Very few of them that I'm seeing, especially in the first generation, they're not quitting work to come to school. They're just working in really bad jobs. And those jobs may be a long ways away from school. I had a student He was leaving my class, driving an hour and a half from Redlands back to Glendale, California, to work at a burger place.
Wow.
But he's putting food on the table.
Right.
And
He has no he has no choice, and to your point, I think don't we conclude from this that regardless of what this looks like in the future, it has to be nimble. I think the military is a great example of that. So are single mothers, right, or caregivers. Even in Canada, we have caregivers who are attending programs that have been rigidly structured from Monday to Friday, but of course they've got to earn a living here, and to do that, they are typically working nannies, and so they've had to, or the institutions that are training them, have had to realign their program schedule to weekends. So it's an interesting landscape right now, but I guess no matter how you look at it, we got to be more nimble, right?
Yeah.
So
pivot. But also, it's and I'm sort of jumping ahead here in your agenda, but
sure.
The student that's working at a burger place, how does he turn that from a job into a career? And so I had another student in the same, and I think he did drop out. He couldn't balance things well enough. And I think the dissonance between being around all these pretty stable, well-off kids and his life was so much that the gap just got to be too much. But I worked with him, and we created independent studies for him to get his unit load up, where he went to his employer and offered to do like training for other employees, offered to work on projects just at the little restaurant. And I wanted him to start thinking like an owner, start thinking like somebody who had some agency. And he loved that. And I mean, I never confirmed that he did it or didn't do it, but he reported back, yeah, it went really well. I offered to do this. And I've had other students working in retail. One of them did a climate survey of the 10 people working in her little fashion store at the mall. And goes back to the self-confidence issue. She said, everybody looked at her different after that. It's like, oh, she's on her way somewhere. She's going someplace. And just that boost. I've had students connect with people, hire, one of the assignments is find a mentor. So she was working in a social service agency at Riverside County. And she said, I wonder if the head of my whole unit, she's like 5 levels above me. I wonder if she'd take a call. I said, how are you going to find out? She said, I'll give her a call. And she came back the next week. She goes, I got an appointment. She wants to mentor me. I'm like, well, of course she does, because you reached out. So that ability to overcome those fears and make those contacts is part of that shift. But believing that you're worthy of it too, and then for teachers, believing that your students are worthy of it, I think is really important. And the research that I've seen coming out of Aspen Institute around the job is that 15 or minimum wage thing or under the table thing that, yeah, it pays some bills, but you don't like doing it. It may not be particularly safe. It might be gig work. And gig work's okay if it's on top of something else, but gig work by itself can be really tough.
Right.
But the idea of career, and there's different terms for it. And I think as educators, we have to test in our local community what words students use, so we know we're saying something clear to them. But the idea of something that has a starting point, a middle point, and an end point, that's better than just being at that same below minimum wage job for 30, 40 years. Because they've been interviewing people in the Los Angeles Times. There's a guy he's my age. He's been pushing an ice cream cart around his neighborhood for the whole time I've been at Redlands.
Wow.
So his pay the first day of work and his pay now with inflation is exactly the same. I mean, mine seems that way at Redlands, but actually they've been pretty good to me. So I used to joke about how low my pay was, and I'm not joking about that anymore. Even with the cuts, I'm very privileged. I'm very happy to be able to do what I'm doing and talk to you. But I also realize how fragile that is.
So what conclusions do we come to when it comes to standardized testing? the value of SSATs, SATs, GMATs, LSAT scores. What do you think about standardized testing?
So I took the GMAT before I went to grad school. So fall of '83, I was applying to grad schools. And then I got to grad school. I did pretty well because I test well. And I was actually auditing a statistics class because I'd had it at undergrad and they thought I knew math well enough as an engineer. And we were talking about correlations and prediction of variance. And so I opened up the GMAT brochure and it said, our correlation to your performance in your MBA program is I think the R was 0.3, and you square that, you get 0.09. So 9% of your performance. Now that's significant, 9%, but really only 9%? And because it excludes a lot of people don't even get into grad school if their scores are below a certain point. You don't know how they would have done. And it turns out that people who score badly on GMATs do pretty well in MBA programs because there are enough programs that take them without. And we've gone back and forth. When we institute requirements like that, we see probably a 25% drop in enrollments. If you want to talk about a universal design that's inclusive and equitable, you can't use those. Those tests came out of the I want to say World War I era to try and figure out which arm of the military you put somebody in. So if you scored low on those tests, you went in the infantry. If you scored well, you went somewhere else. Maybe you got a slightly better job. They weren't meant for this kind of screening. But if you want to talk about, further evidence of lack of equity, if the entire system is built to weed you out, well, I don't want you to become an MD, so what am I going to do? Make you take a test. Make sure there aren't enough slots in medical school. Make sure there aren't enough slots in residency programs. Make sure that you can't get through. And then you look at the demand and you say, and then there's this huge shortage of doctors in rural areas. Well, what's causing that? A system that's meant to get you out of there. We love our physician assistants in California because they can fill in for our docs and do 98% of what they do. And once you meet one, you're like, well, this is fine. Just get me in and out of here as long as you're healthy. But if I have a problem, I want somebody backing them up. But that system was designed to keep people out, to raise the ladder behind the people that are in it, keep wages high and exclude.
It's a great answer.
To me, that's sort of my problem with higher education. So it's like, we can't redesign my university to be inclusive unless we throw out the whole idea that you can only get in here if you're good enough. It's like, no, actually, if you're good enough, you shouldn't be here. I want the people that aren't making it. And then I want to design systems that will make up for deficiencies that they've had in their prior education, and then let them take the time to do that well, and then go forward. And that's where it comes back to the traditional clock model of hours is not our friend for that.
That's all great points. Destigmatize, right?
Yeah.
And make it more equitable.
Yeah.
And find somebody's skills because everybody has them. It's just a question of what is it that they were meant to do.
Yeah.
And,
vocation.
right.
Yep. But the other thing is the stigma of the college. Our stigma, we are stigmatized by those underrepresented and under-resourced communities as a place not welcoming to me.
Yeah, that's
a mistake. That's a huge mistake, and we need to fix that because
absolutely. And you've touched on something that's very dear to my heart, which is, the question of labor market demand. Mm-hmm. And because whether it's Department of Labor statistics in the United States or what we call NOC codes in Canada, mm-hmm. These vocational identifiers all lead to the same road. I mean, they've been misused on both sides of the border, in my humble opinion. In the US, mainly for, or at least in large measure, for immigration purposes, but in Canada, for regulatory purposes to identify which programs should be regulated. Your point is an excellent one, that if we paid less attention if I understand you, James, to those tests, we might, we might be able to meet the labor market demand more appropriately and fill a lot of positions that needed vocations that really aren't where the need currently isn't being met. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and I would put those in a bigger category of what we would probably call structural barriers. So we met a startup founder through another incubator in Riverside. He's formerly incarcerated and he wants to open a group home with vocational skill training for people who got out of prison or jail and help them transition back into successful lives. And there's a lot of challenges for them. One of the challenges is that if you have a felony conviction, you can't get a certification as in a lot of the trades. You're barred. With some good reason, but if you were convicted on a non-violent drug offense and you're now in rehab, I would say that's kind of ridiculous. So there's some legislation that needs to happen to relax some of those structural barriers, but those are in the same category to me as those tests. They're there to keep people out. Why? Because the people who have those jobs don't want to be flooded with too many people coming in. And this is a 100-year, 200-year-old problem. We don't want to have overproduction. Frederick Taylor was the inventor of scientific management. And his idea was that you push the machinery as hard as it could possibly go. And then the human interface should be designed in such a way that people who have the physical characteristics best suited to that job would get the job. And then you pay them more because they'd be extra productive. And that generated this fear that if we produce too much, they'll lay us off because we'll overproduce. So it's a misunderstanding of that relationship. But there's still this fear, I think, in a lot of the trades of, oh, we don't want to flood these with a bunch of people because that's going to hurt business, as opposed to then you look at these bigger labor statistics that say, oh, there's hundreds of jobs going open. There's jobs in programming. There's jobs in, the one I love is something called product management, which I didn't even know was a title. It's not project management. It's creating new products. I'd love that job. That would have been perfect for me. I'm modeling my work right now. My whole research is around that job, really. It's like, that's so cool. It's inventing goods and services to meet unmet needs. What could be cooler than that? Well, that's taught over in these high school programs. That's over in manufacturing. I want to bring it over into entrepreneurship because those skill sets turn out to be important. Oh, and then this other skill set, oh, it turns out that's over in sociology, how to talk to people and map out a social situation. So it turns out our friends in the social sciences and the liberal arts have great skill sets. We just haven't mapped those onto the needs of 21st century jobs. And I think this disaggregation down and getting rid of these barriers and then helping people who may have developed those skills somewhere else attest that they have them. And then when they're weak or if they want to grow into the next job above, that stackable credential then moves me up from, hey, I'm already at this base level, but boy, I could get a $10 an hour raise if I did X. Let's go.
Well,
so that's a roundabout answer, but all these structural barriers keep you in that entry-level position or keep you out of a profession entirely.
We're running out of time, so I'm going to ask you one final question that I confess that I ripped off from Dan Rather, which is, what is the one question that I haven't asked you that you wished I would have, and what's the answer to that question?
Well, I want to loop back. One of my colleagues, he goes to Rick Warren's church down in Orange County, and Rick wrote a book called The Purpose-Driven Life. And he was a good friend of Peter Drucker's, and he used Drucker's management techniques to grow his megachurch, which I have sort of mixed feelings about. But the interesting thing about that title is this idea of purpose and why am I here? And when you start to get aligned with that, and I feel like the work I'm doing now is more aligned than I've ever been. And so it's very motivating and it gives you a reason to get up. And I think, so I started looking at other religious traditions, because in the Christian tradition that I grew up in, that's pretty common, the idea of you were picked, God chose you to do something. And the church school I went to before University of Washington, we actually talked a lot about that, about how faith and things get integrated together. And it's sort of that you're living your faith in the way that you achieve your profession, not just by going to church. So I asked one of my Hindu colleagues, and he said, oh yeah, there's a Hindu scholar who wrote about two kinds of caste. And Rama wasn't disapproving. He thought this was really great. He said, there's the one you're born into, so sort of your destiny. So if I'm born into a poor immigrant family and they bring me across the border when I'm 3 years old, that's my caste. I'm destined to be in that, whatever that means, and never get out of it. And then there's the one that you choose. And you don't hear people in India talk about that very much. But that's their sort of secular goal. It's being a little overwhelmed by nationalism, as it is a lot of places. But I think if I think about what's the career that you choose, not the one that you were born into. So when I went to my 20th high school reunion, my friend Jim Hall said, Jim, how's the helicopter business? I said, Jim, I don't know. My dad went out of business. That was, like 15 years ago. I didn't become a helicopter pilot. You didn't. That's all you talked about. This guy knew me from 3rd grade on. It's like, that's all you ever talked about. Well, it turned out not to be my path. Wasn't where I was supposed to go. Now, he was a kid who played with Army toys the whole time and spent his career in the Marine Corps. So he clearly found his path and seemed to really enjoy it. He was down at Camp Pendleton last time I talked to him. So that idea that path is out there for you, but it may not be the one you thought you were on. And that's, I tell undergrads that it doesn't really matter. They can't make up their mind on a major. I'm like, just pick one. It won't be what you end up doing anyway. So don't worry about it. Just get that degree. But now I'm backing up from that and saying, well, then don't waste your time here. Why don't you go out and work for a year, do something you don't like, and then volunteer somewhere doing something you do like. And then come back and talk to me. So I think that's kind of that loops back to that co-op thing. How do you find out? Your mom and dad can't tell you. Your genes can't tell you. We can't do a DNA map that says you're ideally suited for X. It's just too complicated. And maybe you try something and you do it for 10 years, and somehow at year 11, you realize, oh, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore. I've been really fortunate. I can pivot at the University of Redlands. Every 5 years, I pick a new class to teach. That keeps me from getting bored. My wife spent 15 years in her job and then built a new one from scratch. And she's been doing that for the last 4.5. And she's had tons more stress, but tons more reward. But she paid her dues, got to know the company. Her job didn't exist 20 years ago when she started working there. And now it's a pivotal part of the company.
James Spee, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Harris. This was fun. I enjoyed talking to you. This was very relaxed. We could probably go another 6 hours, like you said, but I think we'll let our editors take care of this, make it a reasonable length so people can.
Absolutely. Stay safe, and
all right.
it's the wildfires in California.
Thanks.
See you soon.